Welcome back, everybody, to our Marsh Watch series for Newfoundland and Labrador. We're heading into our fourth session tonight, which is our halfway mark. And we'll be doing bird ID and frog ID session 3 today. I am coming to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the land of the Mi'kmaq people. And we are also going to be talking about species of birds and amphibians that are found across Newfoundland and Labrador tonight, which are the lands of the Inuit, Innu, Mi'kmaq, and previously the Beothuk. And I'd just like to encourage anybody who wants to learn more about the lands that they live on to explore some more on a website called nativeland.ca, and that's a really good resource. Just to introduce myself for anybody who hasn't been to any of our previous sessions, I am Jenna McDermott. I'll be presenting this evening. My colleague Catherine Dale is here as well. She's manning the chat and helping out with anything that pops up. I always forget to mention, but if you have any questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat. We will have time for questions at the end as well. And Catherine and I both work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national nonprofit, and our mission is to engage people through science to protect the birds we love. And Birds Canada has a lot of programs across the country. Many of them are citizen science programs. And so we're always happy to chat with folks about how to get involved in collecting data for science. Today, we will be going through several different things. We'll have some birds at the beginning, then we'll go into a little amphibian 101 before we get into the frog species that we're covering. And then we'll have a little quiz time at the end, which will be anonymous just to see how everyone's doing and solidify what we're learning tonight. So these are our species for the day. We'll have 4 species of bird and 4 species of frogs. But it's going to take us most of the time anyway. And the birds that we're covering today are all blackbirds. So that's a family. The family is Icteridae. We have 4 species, as I mentioned. There's 2 that I've starred there, the bobolink and the rusty blackbird. They are both species at risk, and we'll chat about them as we come to the species accounts. And then 2 of the species, red-winged blackbird and rusty blackbird, which are in blue there, are really wetland obligates. And the other 2 will use wetlands, but can also live in other areas as well. When we are talking about blackbirds generally, with some exception, they typically have dark plumage, really sharp pointy bills that you can see in the silhouette there. And a lot of the time, they are polygynous, which means that males will have several different females within their territory that they're meeting with. And a lot of the time, blackbirds will also, the females will also mate with several males as well, which means that they're also polyandrous. So this is an interesting sort of social relationship that blackbirds have. And it also means that chicks from the same clutch will often have different fathers. And they sort of live in a semi-gregarious or semi-colonial format. We'll talk a little more specifically about species as we go along, but that's pretty general across blackbirds. Also, they are pretty comfortable walking on land, so you'll see these sorts of birds, hopping along, getting food off the ground as well. And as I said, they are semi-colonial, but they're often also quite territorial. Our first species for the evening is the bobolink. He's a pretty crazy looking bird. This is the male that we have here on the slide. They're a medium-sized blackbird. And if you take a look, he has a long conical bill. It's fully black in the males. And it's almost a little bit like a sparrowy bill, which are also conical shape, but blackbird bills are really quite sharp at the end. Bobolinks have a large flat head and a short neck, as well as a pretty short tail. And if you look at the coloring for the male, you'll see he's black underneath and white generally on top, with a white back and a white wing patch, as well as a big straw-colored patch on the back of his head that looks sort of like a helmet kind of thing. They're actually the only North American bird that is pale on the top and dark underneath. Usually it's the opposite. And typically it's the opposite because as you fly, if we pretend we're a bird flying, and usually they would have a pale underside, that means that anything, a predator looking from underneath of them up towards the sky will have a harder time seeing them against the sky, white against the sky. And also dark on the back would be harder to see looking from the sky down to the ground. So bobolink have this sort of opposite thing, which is really quite interesting. Um, bobolinks are not really a wetland obligate, but they will live in grassy wetland edges and use these sort of wetland areas. But they are more of a grassland species. And a lot of the time they're actually using hay fields, which can be a source of a major source of threat for them. And this is one of our species at risk tonight. And they are ground nesters, so since they're often nesting in hay fields, they can actually lose their whole nest when it's hay harvesting season, because they're nesting on the ground amongst the hay. And so across Canada, there's a lot of work from conservation groups that are working with farmers to get them to delay harvest so that the young can fledge before the hay is harvested, and so then they'll survive. And that's really an important thing for helping us conserve bobolink. Oh, I forgot to mention the male here. This is his breeding plumage in the winter time or the non-breeding season. He will sort of take on a more female-like plumage, which is this is the female here. Hmm. As for all of our species that we talk about throughout Marsh Watch, the size and shape are similar for the male and female, of course, and so it's a medium-sized blackbird again. She has that same conical bill, only instead of being black, it's pink, which is a really good mark for them. And they have a really kind of leggy appearance. Like if you look at all those pictures, their legs look almost ridiculously long. And that just helps them get around in the grasslands, hopping around on the vegetation. And so the female is this sort of streaky straw colored all over. She does have a dark eye line, which is only behind the eye, it doesn't extend out towards the bill, as well as she has a dark cap with a pale central stripe that's up at the top of the head. And in addition to being kind of straw colored, she also has a bit of a yellowish wash to her belly. And she looks a little bit generally kind of more sparrow-like. You could pretty easily get her confused with a sparrow, but she is a blackbird. Um, Bobolinks are typically eating things off of vegetation. So they're sort of snatching insects off of vegetation. They'll eat the seeds as well. They'll go for spiders and snails, all that kind of thing. So they're a bit opportunistic, but they're definitely eating a lot of grains as well. And they make this really crazy vocalization. The males will sort of puff up their whole body and spread out their tail and make these kind of R2D2 or robot noises. So it's really, really quite a distinct sound. And you'll be able to see him if you're in an area with bobolink sort of flying up and they flutter in this sort of helicopter kind of floating display flight and making these R2D2 or robot kind of noises. Bobolinks are found across North America and they do migrate down to South America for the winter um, in a really quite a long migration. If we look to their summering grounds or their breeding grounds, you'll see that they are found in southern Canada and the northern United States. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, we don't have any in Labrador because that's, too far north for their range. But we do have a little corner in the Codroy Valley of southwestern Newfoundland where there are bobolinks. It's just a really small amount compared to probably the grassland areas of other areas of the country. So bobolinks, as I mentioned, are a species at risk. They are nationally threatened, and they've been recommended by COSIWIC to downlist to special concern. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, they are listed as vulnerable. And that's because of things like habitat loss from native grasslands to agriculture, pesticide use, hunting, especially on migration, and in their wintering grounds, and nest loss as well, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, our next species is the red-winged blackbird. This one's maybe more familiar to folks than the bobolink, which is not as easily seen. The male is very striking bird. Again, we have a medium-sized blackbird. We have that sharp black cone-shaped bill. You can just see exactly how sharp it is here in the red-winged blackbird. And the male here is fully black except for having these striking red and yellow shoulder patches. And they can really be lifted out, especially when they're displaying, like in the picture on the bottom left, where he'll spread out his wings and tail and make some display vocalizations. And then you can see them really strongly, or they can be a little bit hidden or tucked away. And they do have variable amounts of yellow in them. Sometimes it's more or less. Males will have on this fancy black and red plumage all year round rather than going into a non-breeding plumage. And the males display by sitting on the top of cattails or other high perches and singing up there. And they sing this a song that could be said in human words as conqueree, but I'll let you listen. So they also have that really high-pitched sort of C noise as well. This is the female red-winged blackbird. Again, a medium-sized blackbird. She also has a sharp black cone-shaped bill, but she is mostly streaked brown all over. There's not too much to note other than she has a pale eyebrow that really sticks out. And if you look to her face, you'll see a sort of faint yellow or orange wash at the base of the bill. In all of those photos, you can see it a little bit, and that can be somewhat variable. If you look to the photo on the bottom left there, you'll see that that female has a little patch of color on her shoulder as well. And so older females that are over 2 years old can start to get a little bit of the red on the wing patch like the males have. Red-winged blackbirds, unlike bobolinks, are wetland obligates, and so you'll find them really mostly in marshes or other wetlands with a lot of cattails and emerging vegetation. So you can see a really good picture of that in the middle bottom there. And they'll make their nest by sort of hanging it between several different stems of these cattails. This is just a list, I guess, of all the different noises that they can make in the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. You could find that if you just Google Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. And this is just to say that red-winged blackbirds, and blackbirds generally, but red-winged blackbirds are incredibly noisy. So if you go to a marsh where you have red-winged blackbirds, you're going to hear them all the time making a whole host of different noises. And they are very territorial, even though they're sort of semi-colonial. They're quite territorial, not only between themselves, but also to intruders of various varieties. And so you can often see fights between males as they compete to claim and defend territories, and females will also make a variety of calls, not just the males. Red-winged blackbirds are incredibly common in North America, and they are found quite abundantly in other provinces, like Ontario, where I grew up, for example. You see them basically in little patches of marsh, like on the on-ramp to the highway kind of thing. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we don't have them nearly in as high numbers. They're not found in Labrador because it's a little bit too far north for the most part. But we do have them across the island of Newfoundland. but in much smaller numbers because, as we've spoken about at the beginning of the Marsh Watch series, we don't have really that many big marshes. So you'll find them in places like Corner Brook and Grand Falls, Windsor, where you have large marshes, but we don't have huge numbers of them around. Our next blackbird is the rusty blackbird. This is probably the most common blackbird species in Newfoundland and Labrador. Um, the rusty blackbird, um, in breeding plumage, I have both the male and the female on this slide. The male on the left there is fully black all over, and he's iridescent. So depending on the lighting, you could get a little bit of purple hues, blue, maybe a bit of green. But otherwise, he's fully black with a pale eye sticking out. The female is also quite dark. She's more of a slate gray, so not really that iridescence that you find on the males, but depending how far away they are, you might not really be able to tell between male and female. Generally, though, as a species, they're a medium-sized blackbird again, similar to the previous ones we looked at. They have a pale eye, which really stands out from the dark face, and they have that same blackbird, sharp black cone-shaped bill, but theirs is a little tiny bit down-curved at the tip, which you can see in both the male and the female. In the non-breeding season, their plumage is more what you would expect from a name like Rusty Blackbird. So we have the same size and shape, of course. Their bill remains dark and sharp and a bit downturned, but both the male and the female take on this brownish to rusty colored feathering. And the males will have a bit more black down in the tail and the body area. But both the males and the females will be this mix of rusty colored feather edges. They'll have a pale eyebrow and a dark eye line as well, with some other darkness around the eye. And so that's one of the reasons why they have their name of Rusty Blackbird. Um, this sort of brown plumage of the males is their fresh feathers, and as the year goes on, those rusty tips will wear off, which gives them this fully black feathering of the summer. So rusty blackbirds are another one of our wetland obligates. So they really need those edges of wetland surrounded by forest. That's what they're using all across their range. Um, they're opportunistic feeders, so they're really going to walk around a lot on the edges of the water. They're looking for things like aquatic insects that are found along the edges, and they will eat a little bit of fruits or seeds if they come across them, but they're really looking for those insects. This is a picture of a habitat that I found them in, a little pond that I found them in Newfoundland. And so they nest in the trees up off of the ground, right beside areas that are nice and flooded, like this one here. And they'll perch on top of the trees and do their display calls from there. And both males and females will call. And so they sound a little bit like a rusty gate, which is another reason, it could be another reason why they're called rusty blackbirds. So you can listen to that now. Play that once more. So it's that high squeaky, rusty gate opening sort of noise, and the notes are slow and separate from each other. The rusty blackbird is really a boreal bird. They are found across North America in the boreal forest and across Newfoundland and Labrador, other than in the above the tree line. And this is our other species at risk tonight. So they're listed nationally in 2009 as special concern, and in Newfoundland and Labrador, they're listed as vulnerable. Whoops. Oh, sorry. I'm really advancing there. One of the biggest threats for the rusty blackbird is loss of habitat. So they seem to be doing a little bit better potentially in Newfoundland. That's just sort of anecdotal, that folks think that they have a little bit higher numbers than elsewhere across their range. But generally, wetlands are often lost to development or reservoir creation and that sort of thing, particularly on their wintering grounds as well in the Mississippi Valley. Um, there's also thought that former large amounts of hunting of beavers might have reduced the population by reducing the number of beaver ponds that were available. Um, and so there's several postulations of why they could have underwent such a 70 to 80% decline. Um, sorry, an 80 to 99% decline, but it's not entirely sure why. Our last bird of the evening is the common grackle. I have both the male and female here on the same page. The common grackle is quite a large blackbird, so we're talking about a species that's pretty significantly larger than the last ones we've been speaking about. Um, they have a pretty long and heavy bill in comparison as well, so they're sort of creeping in on, a crow kind of bill almost, but they are really pointed at the end, just like the other blackbirds we've seen tonight. And they also just have kind of a lanky build generally. So they have long legs, they have a long bill, long kind of neck, and they have a really long, broad tail. And that's a really good mark for the common grackle, is that long, broad tail. And you can see how it's sort of piled up on itself in the picture of the male there. When they open their tail up, that's really feathered open in a big fan. The male up on the top is dark overall. In the picture, the lighting is really nice. So you can see the iridescent blue, purple of his head. But if the lighting wasn't really good, he would just look black all over. In good lighting, though, the body also appears bronze. So when you have that nice lighting, he has this kind of hooded appearance with those bright colors. And he has a white eye. The female down below there is less glossy and generally more brown than the male, but otherwise looks the same. Um, and they make a sound that's a little bit similar to the rusty blackbird, but it's a little more gravelly almost, and the notes are closer together. So you can listen to that. So it's a bit of a kind of guttural squeak or with some whistles. It's really hard to always to describe sounds. But again, it's a little bit of a rusty door kind of noise as well. And so males and females will both make these vocalizations, but the male, while he's displaying, will again puff up his body feathers and spread his tail wide in a very fancy display. So they are just, again, common grackles are, again, not really a wetland obligate, but they will use wet areas. And in Newfoundland, where I've seen them, I have found them mostly associated with water, even though that's not necessarily the only places they can live. But they do like areas like swamps, open woodland, and forest edges, and could be found pretty well anywhere other than a densely wooded area. So they're not going to be in the middle of a thick forest. They're pretty opportunistic in basically everything, including their habitat and what they're eating. So they will go for insects, especially during the breeding season. They will also eat a lot of seeds and agricultural grains. That can really be a problem for them and for farmers because they can descend in really big numbers on agricultural fields and sort of strip them because they're hungry. And so they've got a bit of a bad name for themselves in certain areas, especially because they also will eat the eggs of other birds, various other animals as well. And so they are, yeah, pretty opportunistic. They'll go for whatever they can find, and they'll also even come to bird feeders as well. So that makes them pretty good at surviving in a lot of places. And they are found throughout North America, except for in the most western areas and farther north. They're not really found in Labrador, and they are found a little bit In more areas of Newfoundland than this map would suggest, they are found on the Avalon Peninsula, and they sort of seem to be expanding a little bit more to cover the island, although not in big numbers. And just adding these two bonus birds really quick, because we've been talking about these sort of fully all black birds, but we do also have the common raven and American crow, of course. And so these aren't from the blackbird family. They're actually corvids, the corvid family. But they are fully dark birds with large pointed bills. And they're found sort of everywhere, including wetlands. So you'll come across them, of course, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, if not all of you. They are much bigger generally than the blackbirds, and they have heavier bills. And we're not going to get too much into them, but you can tell the two species apart from each other in flight, especially well by the shape of their tail. So if you look at the common raven on the bottom left, you'll see it has a wedge-shaped or diamond-shaped tail. And the American crow on the right has sort of a flat, squared off tail. And so that's a really great marker for being able to tell those two species apart. And I'll leave that where it is for those two. And let's move on now to our amphibians for the evening. So this is just a little bit of basic information on amphibians. Since we've been talking about birds thus far, and amphibians are obviously a whole different ball game. So they're opposites in a lot of ways to birds, but one major one is that they are ectothermic. So they're cold-blooded. That means that they're not producing any body heat for themselves. They're only using the heat from the environment. The amphibians include frogs, toads, and salamanders. There aren't any salamanders, as far as I know, in Newfoundland, except for sometimes there's some that I don't know about. In Labrador, there are a couple of species. I'm not going to go through them during the MarshWatch series. We're focusing on frogs and toads because we can also identify them by vocalization. And amphibian is coming from a Greek word that means double life. And so they live on both land and in water. And that's because of how their life cycle works. So you can see the frog life cycle here on the bottom in this little diagram. The adults will lay eggs in the water, and you can see a picture of wood frog eggs up here on the left in that picture. They'll lay these big masses of jelly-like eggs, and they need water to keep the eggs moistened so that they can hatch. So that's all of the amphibians will need some sort of water during their life for that. And from the eggs, they'll grow embryos. The embryos will hatch into tadpoles, and the tadpoles at that point are breathing, living underwater all the time and breathing from gills. The tadpoles will grow legs, back legs, and front legs, and then they'll lose their tail and metamorphosize into frogs or toads. And then they're breathing out of lungs. So they go from gills to lungs, which is really crazy. And at that point, then obviously they can live on land as well. So they also have a moist, permeable skin. So that's why if you pick up a frog, it feels very wet on your hand. And they have such thin, wet skin because they can also breathe through their skin rather than just through their lungs once they're adults. So that's why it's also important to not touch a frog or toad or salamander when you have anything on your hands like sunscreen or bug spray, because they can really absorb that and it can be quite toxic to them. So that's just a little note. But because of that, amphibians can also be a really good marker of water quality because of that porous skin. And so they are really affected by things like pollution or pH changes of water and that sort of thing. If we dial down into frogs and toads specifically, in birds, we have, several different markers that we use to identify them. We talk a lot about sexual dimorphism, or the difference between males and females and how they look. In frogs and toads, males and females look generally the same in terms of their color and their form a lot of the time. But males will often have either a darker or a yellow throat that has really loose skin, and they use that to inflate for calling. And females are often much larger and heavier. So in the photo of the toads on the right, the female is the gigantic one, and the male is the smaller one. Same species, just a male and a female. And the females are so much larger and heavier because they need that extra space to store the thousands of eggs that they'll lay. A lot like birds, they will make various noises. So you can have obviously general croaks and sort of screams, that sort of thing for alarm or surprise, but they do have a main identifiable sound that the males make to advertise themselves during the breeding season, much like birds do. So that's through the spring and summer, depending on the species. The timing will change. And males have a large inflatable vocal sac, which you can see on that spring peeper picture in the left, which helps to reverberate the sound of their calling. And so how it works is they inflate that big vocal sac, and then they move the air between the vocal sac and their lungs and push the air across their vocal cords. So every time the air pushes between the vocal sac and their lungs, it makes that noise and it reverberates around inside of the vocal sac. And that can come in three different formats. There can be either one big vocal sac at the bottom of the throat, like you could see in the spring peeper, or you can have two at the bottom of the throat that sort of just billow it out to the sides a bit more, but it looks like one. Or they can have two separate ones on either side of the face, right under the eyes, and they sort of billow out like separate balloons, which looks really kind of crazy. But those are the three formats that they have. So there's a couple of important structural ID points for frogs and toads that we are going to talk about tonight and generally if you're ever trying to identify any other species. So there's these things called dorsolateral folds. Dorso is the dorsum is back and lateral would be up and down. So there are these two lines that go from behind the eye down to the back of the pelvis, and there's one on each side of the back. It's always hard to see the far one because it's sort of up at the top of the picture. And those are for increasing body surface area for extra gas exchange. Since when they breathe through skin when they're in water, they can always use a little extra surface area to breathe. Then we also have the tympanum, which is this circular area right behind the eye. And the tympanum is a fancy word for their external eardrum. And so we obviously have eardrum inside of our ear, but they have their eardrum sitting outside of the body. And that does attach, of course, to their inner ear, and that's their main way of how they hear, but they also can hear through vibrations in their body as well. The tympanum of the males is often larger than that of the females within a species, and that's because it helps them to project their vocalizations as well, which seems a bit crazy to be able to use it that way, but it does. And then the last thing that we can look for are these things called parotoid glands, which you can see on the toad picture on the bottom left. And parotoid glands are an external skin gland that secretes neurotoxins to deter predators. So if you picked up, or if like a snake tried to eat this toad, it would secrete that neurotoxin from the parotoid glands so that it would hopefully get dropped. So parotoid glands are most often found in toads, with some exceptions, of course. The dorsolateral folds are useful in that they are either present in some species, absent in others, or in sort of a middle zone for other ones. And all of the species, frogs and toads, will have a tympanum, but some are really obvious and large, and some are more hidden. And so that can be a good mark. Excuse me. And in addition to that, of course, we're always looking at color markings and listening as well to the vocalizations. So let's talk about frogs and toads in Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador has what is that? One, two, three, four, five different species of toads and frogs that are all native to the province on in Labrador. And all of the amphibians in Newfoundland have been introduced. So there didn't used to be any on the island, but they've come in various stages. So in the 1850s, the green frog was introduced, and it's thought that that arrived in shipments of hay from Nova Scotia. Whether it was purposeful or not is not known. And then in the 1960s, an amphibian enthusiast brought four other species to the Corner Brook area of Western Newfoundland from some populations in Ontario. The leopard frog, northern leopard frog, and boreal chorus frog didn't continue to spread, and they haven't been seen since 1982 and 1989. So those are thought to be extirpated or regionally extinct now in Newfoundland again. But then also in the early 2000s, mink frog was found on the island as well, at one site near Corner Brook during some amphibian surveys by Dr. Workington and Dr. Campbell's labs. And since then, it's also continued to spread in the last couple of decades. So in Newfoundland on the island, there weren't any amphibians before, but now there's quite a few species. And there is a graduate student, or sorry, was a graduate student from Dr. Workington's lab, Dion Kelly, and he looked at whether there might be some effect of having all of these new amphibians in Newfoundland. And he found that there might be little to no impact on dragonfly and damselfly populations specifically, based on his thesis work, but that in areas where there were higher amounts of tadpoles, that it decreased the amount of what is called epilithic periphyton, which is just a fancy word, I think, of saying little tiny algae that's attached to the bottom of water bodies. So basically, areas with more tadpoles had less of that algae available, and that algae is important as the sort of base of the food chain for everything that's aquatic and also not aquatic, because things like insect larvae, snails, and fish will eat that and rely on that. And so if we are having more frogs equals less of that algae, then potentially these other species are seeing an effect from less food. But there, again, hasn't been a super lot of work done on that. Okay, let's get into our frogs for the evening. So we have four species. The first is the wood frog. The wood frog is a kind of medium to small size frog, 5 to 7 centimeters long. The most important marker for them is this dark mask that's over the tympanum, which you can see behind the eye. There's no other frog species in Newfoundland and Labrador that has a dark mask like that. So if you see that, you know for sure it's a wood frog. They also have a white stripe on their upper lip. They have a prominent dorsolateral fold. So remember those lines of raised skin along the back. And the body color can be variable. It can be reddish, light brown, dark brown, which is the case for a lot of the frog species. And then sometimes they also have a white stripe down the back, but as you can see in this individual, that is absent. The wood frog comes out earliest in the spring. They are usually the first ones calling once spring has sprung, and they sound sort of like kind of duck-like. So they have these harsh quacks, and you can listen to them. So it sounds like a whole bunch of little ducks dabbling around together, sort of. That's the wood frog. So there's a couple other pictures of them here. The one on the top left, you can see the white line that they sometimes have down the middle of the body, and the color variation in individuals, but you can see they all have that dark mask behind the eye, which is the key for the wood frog. Wood frogs are found in wooded wetlands and temporary pools, and they actually spend a lot of time on land once they're adults, sort of hiding under and in logs and leaf litter. And during the winter, most amphibians will actually stay in open water to hibernate. But the wood frog actually survives winter by staying out of water on land and allowing its body to basically freeze, which is really crazy. They do this by increasing the glucose in their blood, and that then acts as antifreeze that prevents water in their cells from freezing and bursting. So they basically just say, take me elements, freeze me, and then in the spring they come and thaw again. Um, which is so cool. So because of that, they are, as I said, one of the earliest frogs to start calling in the spring, even when there's maybe still ice on the ponds or snow on the ground. And um, oh, sorry. So this is their range across North America. They are more northern species, sort of up into the tree line. Um, they are found throughout much of Western Labrador. We'll zoom in a bit here through Western Labrador. And as I mentioned, they are introduced to Western Newfoundland in the 1960s. So they're also found on the Avalon now and potentially elsewhere on the island as well. Okay, our next species is the northern leopard frog. Um, they are relatively much larger. They're around 11 centimeters. And their body color ranges from green to brown. The amount of green varies depending on the amount of green in the environment so that they can be camouflaged. And their important markers are that they're covered in large rounded spots, specifically that the spots are round, and also that the spots are bordered by a lighter ring, which you can see sort of zoomed in on the little square on the bottom right as well. There's other species that we aren't talking about because they aren't found in the province that have squarer spots but aren't bordered by a lighter ring. So it's an important note if you're in an area, especially with pickerel frog. The northern leopard frog always has these light colored dorsolateral folds that go all the way down the back. And they also have a pale upper lip, but other species have that as well. So it's not the best mark for them. They come out a little bit later than the wood frog in mid to late spring, and they sound a little bit like a low snoring sound or sometimes rubbing balloons together. Um, I'll let you listen to them. So you could hear that really snoring sound and then also the shorter rubbing balloon sound together. In a large group, they can sound like a distant motorboat. I don't have a sound clip of that, unfortunately. And the sound doesn't travel super well, so if you're really far away in a larger wetland, you probably won't necessarily be able to hear them. But if you're closer by, they'll be the vocalization is a great mark. So here's another couple or a few photos of the leopard frog in its various color forms. But again, you can always notice those light colored dorsolateral folds, the pale lip line, and those light edged spots. In the green one, they're edged in light green rather than sort of white color. Northern leopard frogs live in permanent ponds in a lot of habitats, from the prairies to woodlands to tundra, so they don't really mind if it's forested or not. They just don't prefer areas with large fish. Females will lay gigantic egg masses of between 600 and 6,500 eggs in those big globular masses attached to submerged vegetation, and which is totally wild. Um, 6,500 is sort of an extreme amount, but it can get up to that high. The eggs will hatch in around 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the temperature. And then they stay as tadpoles for 2 to 3 months. And then it takes around 1 to 3 years for the adult or for the immature frogs to reach maturity. And then they live for up to 5 years. So that's just sort of a little bit of a timeline to give you an indication of about how frogs work. If we look at the range map here, we can see that northern leopard frogs are found across Canada and the United States. In Labrador specifically, they're found in Paradise River and several areas near Happy Valley Goose Bay, but they are likely found elsewhere. Just there hasn't been a lot of specific amphibian surveys in Labrador to figure out where exactly they might be. In Newfoundland, as I mentioned before, they were introduced in the 60s, but they are thought to have since been extirpated in the 80s. So we haven't found them on the island since then. Our second last frog is the mink frog. They're a medium-sized frog. They can get up to 7 centimeters. And they get their name because if you disturb them, they will produce a sort of musky, mink-like odor. One account said that it smells a bit like rotting onions to give you a different, if you've never smelled a mink, a different indication of what that might smell like. They are, again, a variable sort of color between green, olive, and brown, but they do have these sort of dark spots and mottling on them, sort of all across the body and on the hind legs. And the spots on the hind legs run lengthwise to the legs, which we'll compare to our next frog, the green frog. They have a yellowish belly, which you can't see in this photo, but if you happen to see one upside down, you'll be able to tell that. And the dorsolateral fold for them can be variable. So in this individual, there is none, or it could have one going all the way down the back, or part way down the back. So that could be telling in itself, but also could be not helpful. One helpful thing, if you can get a look at their hind feet, is that there is full webbing going to the longest toe on the hind foot, which you can see in this photo. The web connects the longest toe to the others. The mink frog starts calling in late spring and calls all through midsummer. And they make a sort of staccato croak. That sounds a little bit like tapping a metal hammer on wood. And if there's a large chorus of them, it can sound like popcorn popping. So I'll let this recording go a little bit longer. And partway through, it gets a little louder, and you could start hearing that popcorn popping kind of sound. So it's quite quiet at the beginning. You can hear that sort of tapping sound. And imagine you're popping popcorn when there's more of them. So that is the sound of the mink frog. Again, a couple other photos. You could see in the top photo that this individual does have the dorsolateral fold going down the back. And again, you can see the webbing extending to the longest toe under the water as well there. So we had the wood frog and leopard frog earlier, and they both hang out on land to a variable extent, but the mink frog really just stays in the water. It's very unlikely you'll find it out on land. And it wants wet areas with abundant vegetation, and it can be in a variety of places as long as they have permanent water, including the acidic water of bogs. And so this is one that we could find in one of our bogs or fens as well. And they're using permanent water specifically because their tadpole stage takes 1 to 2 years. So they obviously need to be able to stay in the water over the winter. And so they need to have water that's not drying up seasonally. This is sort of a more eastern species. It's not found in Western North America, and it is found throughout southern Labrador. This is the one that was first described on the island of Newfoundland in the early 2000s near Corner Brook. Currently, it also shows in iNaturalist as being on the Bayvert Peninsula. And so it is still spreading at this point, and so we'll have to see in decades to come sort of where it ends up. Okay, our final species for the evening is the green frog. The green frog is another large one. It grows up to 11 centimeters and is pretty quintessential kind of frog-looking frog. Nothing too memorable about it. It's quite similar to the mink frog that we just looked at. Um, but let's go through its markers here. Again, we have a sort of variable body color. It can be green, bronze, brown, or even blue. The blue variant is super uncommon. Only one in several thousand individuals have that. And I have a picture of it on the next slide. Um, the males of the green frog often have a really bright yellow throat, which is quite striking. And they have a white belly, in comparison to the mink frog earlier had a yellow belly. They have a green upper lip. And then they have sort of irregular spotting all across their back and side and legs as well. And on the legs, I said we compare this to the mink frog earlier. They have bands of darkness that go sort of crosswise on the leg rather than going with the leg. Hopefully that made sense. Green frogs always have dark dorsolateral folds that go all the way from the eye down to the pelvis. They have a large, distinct tympanum, that outer eardrum that we talked about earlier. And in the males, that will be even bigger than the eye. Again, mostly to compare to the mink frog, if you look at the webbing on the hind feet, the webs do not extend to the longest toe. So you can see that in this picture here. So that's a really good way of telling a mink frog versus a green frog. The green frog is another later one, starts calling from late spring through to midsummer. And another good way to tell the species apart, of course, is by sound, because you're not always going to get a great look at the webbing between the back hind foot of a green frog, but you will be able to probably hear it. And so these ones say gunk, 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 and it's kind of like someone twanging a rubber band or a banjo string. So you can listen to that now. Sorry, I didn't realize this is also quite a quiet one. Hopefully you could hear that a little bit. But you can always search up on the internet as well, the green frog call if you couldn't hear it. So here's the other color variations of the green frog. We have that more greenish yellow and then the blue one underneath, which is super rare. But in both, you can see that really obvious tympanum showing, as well as the dorsolateral fold going all the way down the back. And in the bottom blue green frog, you can also see that it's got a white belly. Green frogs breed in shallow permanent bodies of water. So that's areas like springs or swamps or brooks, ponds and lakes, anything like that. They're pretty easygoing about it. Tadpoles will take 1 to 2 years to metamorphosize into adults. So again, they need these permanent areas so that the tadpoles don't die. Young frogs, however, will use more temporary sections of water, so you'll even find them in little things like potholes that are filled with water, because they can move around, of course. And you'll find green frogs sometimes basking on shorelines, so they'll come out of the water and hang out to warm up as well. Green frogs are pretty tolerant of human disturbed areas, and so they're a pretty common one to see around in rural areas as well. And they're more of a southeastern species, so they don't get up into Labrador because that's too far north for their range. Most of the range is in the eastern United States and southeastern Canada. And as I mentioned in the middle, they were introduced to Newfoundland, the island, in the 1850s, and they've spread pretty massively around since then. So if you look at the map on iNaturalist, you can see that people have seen green frogs sort of nearly all over the entire island. Okay, that brings us to the end of our species. So we'll just do a quick recap before we have a little quiz. So these are our birds that we did today. The bobolink sounded like R2-D2. The red-winged blackbird did this congaree. And the high C sound, of course, amongst a million other vocalizations, but those are the main ones. The rusty blackbird sounded like a rusty gate with separate notes. And then the common grackle also was a little bit rusty gate-like, but the notes are closer together and sort of more gravelly. So those were our 4 birds for the day. And then our 4 frogs that we just went through were the wood frog, which is our smallest one. They did the quacking noise. And had the black mat or the dark mask. The northern leopard frog, which sounded like snoring, and had the light dorsolateral folds and round dots all across the body. That was the northern leopard frog. And then we just did the mink frog, which sounded more staccato, like tapping a hammer on wood or like popcorn. And then we had just finally the green frog. This sounded like a rubber band being twanged or a banjo string. Sorry again, that one's so quiet. To the end of our evening again. So thank you all for coming out again, and I hope that you've enjoyed learning about our blackbirds and some of our frogs today. I would just like to also thank Wildlife Habitat Canada with their funding through the Canadian Wildlife Habitat Conservation Stamp sales or the duck stamp. We've been able to put these webinars on. And anybody can feel free to buy one of those duck stamps if they want to support wetland conservation. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. And if not, then we'll see you next week.